We're going to go ahead and get started tonight. My name is Ellen Bolin. I'm a senior advisor to the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources. And I'm looking forward to talking to you all tonight about coastal resilience and our coastal master plan. So here's what we're going to look like tonight. We're going to go through sort of the welcome, and then we're going to talk about just a broader question around what is coastal resilience and some of the work we're doing around that. The big part of the conversation is going to be, what are your community needs? Trying to understand how flooding is impacting your day-to-day life in your community. So as I go through some of this information, I want you to think, both a few of you in the audience and those of you online, things like, has flooding changed how you get to work? Has flooding changed how you access healthcare? How you get groceries? Sort of, has it affected your day-to-day life? And also understanding sort of how you respond to flooding in your community. And then we're gonna talk about next steps. So how to be prepared, how to stay engaged, and how to follow along. All right, so the first things first, what is coastal resilience? I'm gonna take a minute, sort of let you all read this, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we're gonna talk about the pieces of this definition. So the things I want to focus on today are to strengthen communities' capabilities to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from hazards. And the three pieces we're really going to focus on today is anticipation, how do we prepare for it, and how do we respond to coastal flooding. And then this talks about our goals in terms of wanting to ensure we have social well-being for the public health and the environment. So we're talking a lot today about coastal flooding. We also use the term coastal flood hazards. So coastal flood hazards are just different types of coastal flooding and different ways water may impact your community. So the first one is tidal flooding, pretty common here in Norfolk. We also call that nuisance flooding. So this is flooding, as you can see, that happens pretty regularly when you have a high tide. Not as catastrophic, but definitely an inconvenience. Storm surge flooding. So this is what happens when any big storm makes landfall. This is when the weather is pushing water onshore. It can be particularly catastrophic if it occurs at the time when there's a high tide. Storms also often dump a bunch of rain, which can also be exacerbated if there's existing high tides. And the last one is rainfall flooding. So this is often what leads to flash floods, where there's just so much water in a short amount of time. The infrastructure in that community can't handle it. And in some cases, it's not an issue of needing more culverts, needing more storm drains. It's just the amount of water under any conditions likely could not be accommodated by that community. All right, so what's the challenge? It's pretty big when you look at the numbers. So there's over 6 million people. 70% of Virginia's population lives in a coastal area at risk of flooding. And the damages can be pretty extensive, $1.6 billion in just 2 years. And the other thing about Virginia is it has the highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast. And sea level rise is also rising faster than we thought. So we are getting more water, we're gonna get it faster. What's driving this increased flooding? So I mentioned rising seas, sea level rise due to climate change. It's going to overall bring up more water, which means even low tides are going to be higher, high tides will be higher, more nuisance flooding. Sinking land, so water can erode existing land, which means there's more room for the water to run. Changing weather patterns and severe storms. So this is happening when we have more rainfall more often, and we are getting more frequent storms and more storms that have even more water. We've seen this in the area. Going to continue to be an ongoing challenge. And the last thing is construction. Construction has really two impacts to it. It brings more people to the area, which is very good in some ways, but also a challenge because it can put more people in the path of the water. It can also create impervious surfaces, so surfaces that don't absorb the water. Think sidewalks, think roads. And so when the water meets that, it runs off, and that's where you can get some flash flooding conditions. So let's talk about Norfolk specifically. So this map initially looks a little confusing, and I'm going to talk you through it. The key thing here, if I can get this to work, the red arrow is the "we are here" part of the presentation. So this is give or take right where Norfolk State is. So on you see the 2020 map, and you see this gradation of colors. The things I'd like for you to focus on are sort of the dark blue and then the lighter green areas. This is we're having a So these lighter green areas right here, and then down to these dark blue areas. So the dark blue areas is just mean high tide. This is the water we deal with every day. And then you go to the lightest color, and that is a 500-year flood event. So that's an event we expect to only really occur every 500 years. And it's usually catastrophic. Kind of in between is this lighter sort of green right here. That's a 100-year flood event. Again, we don't expect them to occur very often, but when they do, they're pretty bad. Now, some of the things you might have been seeing more recently is this idea or this statement that we've had, 2 100-year floods in the past 5 years. What that's really describing is that we've had floods that have had 100-year impacts pretty quickly. And we will see that as we move, as we see more climate change, we will see more frequent and more catastrophic storms. But the important thing to note from this, really the takeaway, is that in 40 years, where we are now, so previously we were fine, and now we're in the thick of it. Now Norfolk State, if they were to have a 100-year or a 500-year flood, it'd even be pretty close to a 50-year event, would be impacted by coastal flooding. And you can see there's going to be a lot more people that are going to be impacted by coastal flooding. So the key takeaway from this map is that in 40 years, we will have more people being impacted by more water more often. So this is just a different version of that map looking at community resources. So the dark squares right here represent community resources. These are residences, these are buildings, these are local facilities. So again, we are here. So we have some flood hazard exposure. So chances that we would likely be impacted by a flood. It gets a lot more dire in 2060. You can see a lot more people are going to be exposed to this. Again, there's more people being exposed to more water more often. So what does this really mean for Norfolk? So sort of by the numbers. So the next 40 years, 100,000 more people may be impacted by coastal flooding. 29,500 buildings and 13,500 acres of land. The acres of land is kind of hard to visualize. So for reference, Naval Station Norfolk, which is the largest naval base in the world, is 3,400 acres. So we're looking at an area, doing math on the fly, roughly 4 times the size of Naval Station Norfolk, give or take. 4 times more area will be exposed to coastal flooding. And I think this is an important part of the conversation to talk about. These are numbers. These are big numbers. It's 100,000 people. It's almost 30,000 buildings. It's a big acreage. But the point I really want to make is, as we stand here right now, there are 450,000 people without power all across the US due to coastal flooding. Communities have been devastated by coastal flooding in the past week. If you look at Louisiana with Hurricane Ida, if you look at Humphrey County, Tennessee, and the catastrophic floods 2 weeks ago, if you look at the communities from Maryland to New York that were impacted by Ida last week. So these are not just numbers. These are people, these are communities that have been devastated by coastal flooding. And I just wanted to take a minute to recognize that as we sit here tonight, a pretty dry, sunny day, there are communities that are dealing with this. And there are communities likely near us that will have to deal with this in the not too distant future. This is a people problem, and really want to talk about how it impacts people. So the next part of the conversation, I think, is the best part of the conversation. And what we really want to focus on is trying to better understand what are the needs of this community. So as I mentioned in the beginning, some of the things we are looking to sort of figure out is initially sort of what causes floods here. Is it mostly nuisance flooding? Are you pretty impacted with storm surge when a storm comes through? Are flash floods an issue here? Sort of what does this look like? And has your home ever been affected by flooding? So how we're going to do this now, because we do have people on Zoom, and thank you for joining us, is we're going to talk to people. We have a couple people in the audience tonight, and we have a couple people on Zoom. So I'm going to pause for a minute and see if we're getting any traction on Zoom. I'm looking at Daryl now. For those in the audience, because we have a few people, we have a couple options. I can run through these slides and we can have a one-on-one conversation later, which might be better. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to run through these slides and talk about the information that we need. I will also say that this presentation will be online, and there is an email address at the end of this presentation. So if you know people who couldn't make it today but wanted to offer input, there will be an option for them to provide input after the fact. And we will take questions on this through Zoom sort of throughout the night. But this is really the information that we're looking for. We really want to understand where coastal flooding is happening. And we're really interested in where coastal flooding is happening in historically excluded and under-resourced communities, people who have often not been at the table and not had a voice. So this is some of the things we're looking for in terms of community needs. This also gets back to that first question I asked, how does flooding impact you? So are you having to change your route to work or to school or the grocery store? One of the things we've heard at other meetings is that it affects people's ability to get in and out of their neighborhood. So it can add time to a commute. For all of those, most people on this call who live in the Hampton Roads community know that traffic is already bad enough. And so if you have to reroute for flooding, it can add precious time to your day. The ability to access health care, does it affect your reliability of utilities? Most people now rely on internet to communicate. Many people are still working from home. And then also looking at the community's sewage and septic systems. So I'm going to click to the next slide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about preparedness, and then we'll go to see what questions we get on Zoom. So this goes back to the prepare and respond that I mentioned at the beginning. So the other thing that we're interested in is, where do you get information on disasters? How do you understand what's coming and affecting your community? Is it the Weather Channel? Is it your local meteorologist? Is it the National Weather Service? Is it the Virginia Department of Emergency Management? Is it D, all of the above? And sort of in an event of emergency, do you have reliable access to this information? Because one of the things we've seen with these storms, and it happened very quickly in New York, for example, is the prediction for rainfall changed very quickly. The initial prediction earlier in the day versus what actually fell later was pretty different. And so being able to rapidly get information out to those communities is important. And so understanding how people get this vital information is really helpful as we undertake our planning process. If you have to evacuate, do you evacuate? Do you have a place to go? If you don't evacuate, what are the barriers to evacuation? Is it you don't have a place to go, you want to stay? There's a bunch of different things that can cause hesitancy to evacuation. And it's helpful as we understand that, helpful for us to understand that, particularly when there are large scale evacuations. And also, do you have flood insurance? Are you able to protect your resources in your home in the event of a flood? So the next thing we're going to talk about gets back to the, okay, what do we do? When there's coastal flooding, when there are storms coming, what do we do? And I actually put this slide in the presentation, sort of a last minute add when I gave this presentation last week, because I think it's really good to revisit this, especially after Humphrey County, Tennessee, and a lot of what happened. Because I think people often underestimate what rushing water can do. So if you're faced with a big standing body of water, phrase is turn around, don't drown. And pretty catchy, and it works. Because a couple of things that I want to point out is it doesn't take that much water to have an impact. So 6 inches of water can take out an adult. 12 inches of fast moving water can carry away a small car. So that's not much, that's a foot. And then 18 to 24 inches can take out a small truck or an SUV. So almost, 18 inches of water can take out most people's vehicles. So if you see standing water and you don't know how deep it is, turn around. That is the easiest thing you can do in terms of preparedness and response, is just don't go through that water. And this also gets back to my earlier question of understanding what flooding looks like in your neighborhood. And do you have points of egress or be able to leave your neighborhood? Because if you don't, then this may be a situation where if you have to get out and you have to go through that, that's a safety hazard, and understanding those impacts. Be prepared and know your zone. So this is an actual screenshot from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management of where we are right now. So this, again, this red arrow is approximately where we are. Oh, this is right, is Norfolk State Student Center. And we are right on the edge of Zone B. So not likely, we wouldn't be a first wave evacuation, but for a pretty big storm, this area might have to evacuate. So this is offered from Virginia Department of Emergency Management. You can go in there, you can plug in your address, and it'll tell you exactly where you need to be, exactly what your zone is, and that will help you respond in the event of a storm. The last thing is have a plan. So this is also a picture up here is a Virginia hurricane evacuation guide. These are available online, and we can link to this when we put up the presentation. For those of you in the room, we have them in the back. And this really is going to be the most effective thing to look at in terms of preparation. I could spend an hour on this alone tonight. I won't. This is going to be the best guide for how to evacuate in a hurricane. And really, as we've seen, for a variety of reasons, it's helpful to have this information with you for any sort of mass disaster. But this evacuation guide is very helpful. It gives you a checklist of what you need, of the documents, of numbers that you need to have on hand, sort of the amount of supplies that you need. And again, it's available online, but we also have copies in the back. So more than just being prepared, what else can you do? So one of the things that we have, this is a community flood fund. Now, the important thing to note about this is something that localities can apply for. So this is your local governments that can apply for this money. And what it does is it's going to provide support for regions and localities across Virginia to reduce the impacts of flooding. And the big thing that this does is it's empowering communities to develop solutions. And so if your localities hear from you that this is important to you, that your community needs capacity on flooding resilience, you need capacity to understand what your challenges are, talk to your elected officials, encourage them to look at the flood fund, because it's a resource that can bring dollars to your area to be able to address some of these challenges. So the other thing is, why a coastal master plan, or also why am I here? Because you've seen the logo at the bottom of Virginia Coastal Master Resilience Plan. So some Virginia localities have already started making their own plans for flood adaptation and resilience. And these will help localities, but there's many localities that haven't had a chance to. They don't have the resources yet to create individual plans. No locality can afford to pay for all of the projects and actions to fight further flooding. And often local plans may not consider the impacts to other communities. So what may work for Norfolk may adversely impact Virginia Beach and vice versa. And so a statewide coastal master plan takes a broader look at what is needed and identifies some big picture solutions. So a lot of times you will hear from people about the flooding in their area, it's a storm drain that's blocked. And there are resources for your community for that. There's stormwater local assistance funds that can address this. This is really looking at big picture issues of entire communities flooding, large scale living shoreline projects, different things like that to identify what some of the solutions may be. And by taking this broader view along our whole coastal region, we can identify and address the shared challenges sort of across the coast and inland, as well as the challenges that are unique to certain areas. And this will also help coordination from state, local, and federal efforts in terms of coordinating on dollars or projects and figuring out how to address that. So this is why we're here today, is we are building a database of information and talking to communities about some of the things that need to be identified in the coastal master flood plan, resilience plan, excuse me. The first iteration of this will come out in the fall. This is an ongoing effort to address the changing needs of coastal Virginia around flooding. And so even if you don't see some of that information in the initial draft, or initial run at it, identifying what else can be added as we continue to evolve this process. So that's sort of the be engaged in the follow along and why we're here. Follow along. So there's a bunch of different resources. Encourage you to follow Virginia Department of Emergency Management, Secretary of Natural Resources for an update on the plan, and then also the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is also helping the Secretary's office with this information. So that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions on Zoom, and there's not. So what we're going to do is I really thank everybody for joining us on Zoom today. We're going to go ahead and close that out. And there's a few members of the audience, and so we're going to have some one-on-one conversations with them. But lastly, this is probably the most important slide, this is how to talk to us. So this is the website, Understanding More About Coastal Resilience, and this is where you can email this Resilient Coast VA at governor.virginia.gov is where you can email your questions, particularly if you couldn't make it and wanted to watch the presentation later. Would love to hear from you. So that's what we've got. So for those of you in the audience, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more, and I thank you all for coming tonight.